Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 39 of the Pet Behavior Chat. And today I want to talk about something that's really, really important and is actually going to set the scene a little bit for episodes that are going to come in the future when we dive more into psychopharmaceutical medications and perhaps physical health. Which obviously is a little bit more kind of the veterinary side, I guess, of veterinary behavior medicine. Obviously, we do need to know all about learning and behavior modification and how that affects behavior. But I think as veterinary behaviorists, one of the unique positions that we're in is to be able to tie together the whole sort of the animal's physical health from a holistic point of view. And so today I want to talk a little bit about brain health and behavior and how brain health really strongly affects behavior, as I'm sure you can all imagine. But essentially, behavior originates from the brain, happens in the brain. And so knowing a little bit more about the brain and what might affect it and what might affect its health, I think is super important when we think about, behavior problems, veterinary behavior medicine, all of that. And I really want to start us off super, super early in the animal's life. And that really is looking at genetics and in particular epigenetics and how that already can have a massive effect on how the brain develops. And there's so much to go into here. I'm probably not going to be able to cover everything, but I just want to touch on some of the high points that are, I guess, clinically relevant and that are relevant, I suppose, from, maybe talking to breeders or, people that are really involved in these very, very early periods of an animal's life. So when we touch upon genetics, so genetics is that kind of genetic code that you get with you from your mum and your dad, your parents, reaching back to your grandparents and so on. So that's the DNA. Those are your chromosomes, your chromosomal code that you get with you. And there's been a lot of work done recently into looking at kind of genetics and how that plays a role in behavior, and looking in particular for specific behavioral traits such as aggression or anxiety, fears, and linking those to genetics. And whether there is actually already a genetic predisposition for some of these animals. And, I think the work there is finding that, yes, that is the case. We can have certain breeds or breed colors, coat colors associated with certain behavioral traits. And there are more and more sort of areas in the genetic code that are being identified that might have an effect on behavior, especially if those areas are somehow mutated or, not as they should be. So it's a pretty specific field. I'm not going to go into it in massive detail because I don't actually know, enough about the detail about it. But suffice to say that genetics definitely play a role, and we see that in research, and we see that in studies that are performed, when we're looking at certain phenotypic traits, so certain traits that our animals bring with them, and how that might be affected by their genetic code and how that might affect behavior. So genetics is definitely something that we do want to consider, and that's for sure where breeders come in. So responsible breeding, not breeding animals that do show certain unwanted behavioral traits, I think that's a really, really important thing. And we're doing it for physical health traits, so we're not breeding for hip dysplasia, and we're not breeding for certain other physical health components, whether that's ocular diseases or maybe skin diseases. So we're starting to look at that, but we need to be looking at that for behavior as well. So, I think that's kind of, when we're looking at the bigger picture, that's definitely something that we need to consider in terms of genetics and how that has an effect. The second thing that we want to consider is epigenetics. And epigenetics is basically all the sort of environmental influences that an animal can experience already from in utero. So already when they're still in their mum's womb, right through until sort of that kind of perinatal, postnatal period. So as they're being born, after they're being born, and then throughout their development as well. So we know that environmental influences have a huge impact on how perhaps some of those genes are expressed, whether they're turned on or turned off, and how that can play a role in behavior. And some of the things that we think about here are maternal health. So what kind of physical condition is mum in when she's pregnant? But also maternal behavior. What is mum's temperament, her behavioral style, and what does that mean for her babies? Nutritional health, physical health, all those things are really, really important from the mum's point of view. We know that stressed mothers may absolutely influence the way that the HPA axis, so one of the responses, one of the neuroendocrine areas or physiological responses that's responsible for stress manifestations, how mum's health can influence that. So there's a lot that happens on an epigenetic basis, and it can even be things such as where a puppy is located in the womb in reference to their siblings, so that we know that female puppies that are located in the womb between two male puppies might have a slightly different behavioral style than a female puppy that's located between two female puppies. We know this from experiments that have been done in rats. And that all has to do with circulating androgens. So those are the sex steroid hormones, in particular testosterone. And we know that, for example, a female rat puppy that's located between two brothers in the womb, and that maybe gets more exposure to those circulating testosterones, might have a different behavioral style than if she were located between two girls, two sisters. There might be a little bit more aggression or aggressive behaviors as an adult or after birth. So that has a really big influence, and it's all to do with what we call the organizational effects of these androgens in the perinatal period. So just before and kind of during birth and after birth, the circulating testosterone have organizational effects on the brain. And so if we have high levels of testosterone, i.e. in male puppies, then we're going to have a more male behavioral style, as in situations where we don't have those circulating hormones present. So it's really, really important to understand that already then, probably prior to our influence, we have things happening in the brain that are going to already be predictors for future behavior. Of course, some of the things we can influence. So if we're thinking about, maternal health and maternal care, those are things that breeders absolutely can have an influence on. And, if we're thinking about puppies that come from puppy mills or puppies that are separated from their mums too young and they don't have that full exposure to the, the full length of maternal care, all of those things can have a massive influence. So there absolutely are things that we can influence in that time. And it's really about educating the people that have access to those puppies in those early weeks on, the very best that can be done for them in terms of future behavioral health. So if we think about it, as pet parents, we don't get access to those puppies until they're perhaps 8, 10 or 12 weeks old. So influencing what happens before that is a little bit outside of our control. And that's really where responsible breeding comes in, and where puppies that come from these big breeding mills or, breeding environments and then sold perhaps through pet shops, where they're at a massive disadvantage behaviorally. So that's something that we really, really, really need to think about. So why do I talk about this kind of perinatal and early socialization period? Well, because and how does it kind of, correlate with brain health? Well, because in that time, there's a lot of neuronal pruning that goes on. There's a lot of neurodevelopment that happens in that period. There are new neural connections being made, neurons are being pruned, other neurons are being, make more connections. So there's a lot that happens in the brain in that time. And we want that whole period to be as healthy as possible, and for the brain to be developing as healthily and normally as possible. So that brain health piece starts from a really, really young age. And, that socialization period, we know, which in puppies is from about 3 to 12 weeks, maybe up to 16 weeks. In cats, it's from 2 to 7/9 weeks. that early socialization period and the experiences that puppies have in that time and what subsequently happens in the brain is going to be really, really important and predictive for future behavior. So puppies reared in isolation are, in that important socialization period, are potentially going to have different behavioral challenges than if they're raised with their siblings and their mum, and so on. So there's a lot that happens in that period. A second really important period for that kind of neuronal pruning and neuronal growth and neuronal development is during the period of adolescence, that kind of takes the dog into social maturity. So adolescence starts at sexual maturity, which is anywhere between sort of 6 and 8 months, maybe slightly later in some dog breeds and dogs. And again, during adolescence, we have big changes that happen in the brain from that puppy brain to sort of develop into an adult matured brain. So again, situations or exposures, experiences that the dogs have in that time can be really, really important to how they develop throughout adolescence. And again, it affects the brain. It massively affects the brain. So those are really important time periods as well. And, many pet parents of adolescent dogs know, and human parents of adolescent children, of which I'm not one, know that those periods can be really tricky and really kind of challenging, whether you're a dog or a human person. And yeah, those adolescence periods are challenging, and that's because of all the changes that happen in the brain at that time. So really, really important to think about that. The next thing I want to talk about is neurotransmission, because really everything that happens in the brain, or most things that happen in the brain, really are down to neurotransmission. What is neurotransmission? So we have a few really key neurotransmitters, and they're chemicals that facilitate communication between neurons. So it's that whole kind of neurochemical communication in the brain. So we're talking about substances such as dopamine, noradrenaline, serotonin, GABA, glutamate, acetylcholine. They're these really important and amazing neural substances that facilitate communication between individual neurons and have an effect on the way that the entire brain functions. So they're responsible for whether a neuron passes on information, i.e. fires, or doesn't pass on information, i.e. doesn't fire. And that's really important in the whole sort of big picture when you're looking at how the brain works and whether the brain works really appropriately and really well. And what we find oftentimes in mental health disorders, and when we're kind of looking at some of the things that we're presented with as veterinary behaviorists, is we wonder whether that neurotransmission is dysregulated, whether it's perhaps not functioning as it should be, whether we've maybe got as many receptors as we would like to have to facilitate that normal communication in the brain. And that's really where, our psychopharmaceutical medications come in. But the real skill is to try and understand from the behaviors which of these neurotransmitters might be affected, which of them might not be perhaps working as they should be, and then understanding how we can maybe influence that as veterinary behaviorists through our choice of medications, but also diets and supplements, and how we can perhaps help that brain to function better from a neurochemical point of view, from a neurotransmitter point of view. And the reason I talk about this is I really want to set the scene for future episodes where we do start to talk about psychopharmaceutical medications and how they are used. And, they have to be used with a lot of care and attention. They need to be used with knowledge and understanding of them, how they work, which neurotransmitter systems they actually affect, but also, how they act in both the short term as well as the long terms, because for a lot of our medications, it's actually the long-term changes that we really, really want to harness. It's almost, psychopharmaceuticals can actually cause new protein or receptor formation, and they can affect the way that the genome works within those receptors. And within the neurons and the way we can actually affect long-lasting change through that. So it's a complex topic, and we'll dive into it in a little bit more detail, but it's just kind of setting the scene that actually what happens in the brain is really, really important for behavior. Now, I'm not saying that what happens in the environment isn't equally as important. It absolutely is. So the behavior piece, the learning piece, the antecedent arrangement, your applied behavior analysis, all of that has an equally important role here. And that's one of the things as veterinary behaviorists, is that we look at that holistically. So we look at all the elements we look at the environment, we look at the behavior, we look at what we can actually teach the animal. So that's the learning piece and the behavior modification piece, but also how we can arrange antecedents, so change the environment better in order to, to help facilitate behavior change. But a really, really other important piece is understanding what's going on in the brain and how we can influence that. So that's really kind of, I just want to set the scene for neurochemistry and neurotransmitters and neurobiochemistry and how that all plays a massive role. And again, that unique position that veterinary behaviorists are in, because we are able to prescribe medications that can influence that. And that needs to be done with, as I said, with a lot of care and with a lot of knowledge. And we don't just willy-nilly prescribe these medications. We have to make sure that we have a really good understanding of the diagnosis that we think, we have in front of us, and also which areas are affected in the brain, which neurotransmitter systems might be. Because if we choose a wrong medication that affects a different neurotransmitter system, we're probably not going to get the behavior change that we're looking for. So that's a really, really important piece. The third thing I want to quickly talk about is in a really, really, really kind of broad sense, because there is so much that goes into this. But in a very, very broad sense, I just want to talk a little bit about dysregulation of some of the fear pathways or the pathways that can happen in the brain. And I want to very, very just kind of broadly touch on this and talk about the kind of the limbic system, which is that sort of very reptilian, old, emotional part of the brain that sits deep within the brain, that sits, in the forebrain, and that is responsible for emotional processing, fear processing. And we have a couple of different structures that are in here: the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and a few others that are really important. So this is that emotional, basic, very foundational processing system within the brain. And then we have the forebrain, or the kind of the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex, the frontal areas of the brain that are much more responsible for conscious thought, maybe problem solving, making good decisions, processing information appropriately. And these two areas, so we've got that kind of limbic system, that's that reptilian part of the brain, and then we have the frontal cortices, which are those more thinking, processing parts of the brain. These two areas of the brain need to be very healthily connected with each other, so that the forebrain the frontal area, I keep saying forebrain, the frontal areas of the brain can actually help the brain to make maybe better decisions based on some of the information that's coming in. So the reptilian, the limbic part of the brain, is the brain that wants to keep us safe. It wants to keep us safe. It's going to respond really, really quickly, and it's going to be that kind of emergency fight, flight response system. But the frontal cortices and the sort of frontal lobes of our brain are going to be the ones that can come in and modulate that response and say, hang on, stand down, limbic brain. You don't need to respond in this way right now. Experience teaches us that this is not something that we have to be fearful of, and can really kind of dampen down and modulate that highly emotional response. And in, I'm going to call it a healthy brain, that communication between those two areas of the brain happens really beautifully and really appropriately. And the thinking part of the brain comes in, modulates responses, and prevents those emotional responses from kind of taking over, or from becoming dysregulated, or from becoming out of context. So that's what happens in a healthy brain. And what we often see is that communication is interrupted, and that communication maybe doesn't work quite as well as it should do. And we have the emotional brain taking over, and we have those emotional responses becoming amplified and happening kind of out of context. And that can, again, happen in a few different situations. Adolescence is one of those where that communication doesn't work as well as it should do. We don't have some of these emotional regulation responses coming online until a little bit later. So in adolescence, the communication between those two brain areas isn't perhaps great. And if we have dysregulated fear pathways, and that again can be because we don't have neurotransmitters functioning as they should be, we have that dysregulation of that response, and we have that emotional part of the brain taking over. So this is something that I talk a lot to my clients too, is that we need to be able to access those frontal areas of the brain more. We need to be able to dive into that cognitive processing. We need to be able to slow down that kind of emotional response. Jean Donaldson calls that slow thinking. And that's something that, we also think about, is how can we better establish that communication between those two areas of the brain so that we can get the dog to actually bypass some of these emotional responses and think more rationally and make better choices and better decisions. So, and that's again where medication may come in. And I say may because it might not always be that. It might just be that we need to make some changes to the environment or to the way that the dog's learning. But even if we want to influence the way that they're learning, they might not be able to learn very well if we have this emotionally dysregulated brain. So sometimes we actually use medication in order to facilitate better learning, to then get our end goal of having the dog learn to make better choices. So just a little bit on that. Like I say, as you can imagine, this is a massively complex process. And I really just wanted to kind of touch on that to sort of start giving the idea that we are wanting to influence the way that the brain operates in some of our cases, not all of them. So that would be kind of our neurotransmission and dysregulation. And then the final piece I want to talk about is how physical health affects mental health. And, we've been talking a lot about kind of, other body systems, how they influence the brain. And there's this kind of tendency to sort of separate brain health from other areas of the body physical health. And in fact, it's just physical health, right? The brain is part of that. So separating the brain out from the rest of the body systems probably isn't that helpful. But sometimes I think as we're sort of thinking about problems like this, it can be helpful to think about it in that way. Although we need to always come back to understanding that the brain is part of the rest of the body, and the whole body just functions as one big system, and that the rest of the body systems are going to influence the brain and vice versa. So thinking about our pet's overall general health is really, really important. And knowing that if they have other diseases, that is going to for sure affect brain health or the way that the brain functions. And that's why we always need to be on the lookout for other things that might be happening in this pet's health. And there are a few like really obvious ones, but if we have a neurological presentation, if we have a dog that has epilepsy or that has seizures, that's absolutely going to affect their behavioral health as well. And there are quite a few papers that are looking at anxiety that are perhaps comorbid with epilepsy and how treating, both of those aspects of brain health are going to be really, really important in the overall improvement of that dog's health. So neurological diseases are a big one. Yeah, epilepsy, absolutely. So seizure disorders, epilepsy. In brachycephalic breeds, we're thinking about Chiari malformation. We're thinking about syringomyelia. We're thinking about other things that are going to have an influence. Brain tumors obviously are going to have a massive effect on that pet's health. And sometimes behavior is the first thing that we see changing. Now, there are some regions of the brain that are actually silent to neurological examination. So there are some areas in the brain, again, specifically those frontal cortices, that we can't perhaps get a lot of information from when we're doing our neurological examination. And the only thing that might be changing in that pet is their behavior. And that's the first thing that alerts us that there might be something going on. So neurological diseases, absolutely, that's clear, right? That's not rocket science, that if you have a neurological disease, that's going to affect behavior. But other things as well. Pain is high up there. If we have pain, that's going to affect the way that the brain processes some parts of bits of information, and some of the conscious processing of pain happens in the brain. So pain is a really big one. If your pet is in chronic pain, it's absolutely going to affect their behavior. Now, what about if your pet has an endocrine disease? What about if they have either hypo or hyperthyroidism? What if they have a liver disease? What if they have renal disease? Absolutely, that's going to affect the brain's health. So we can have, uremic disease that can cause encephalopathies. We can have hepatic disease. So we talk about hepatic encephalopathies. That means if the liver is not getting rid of toxins appropriately because it's not working as it should be, then those toxins affect the way that the brain works and can cause massive behavioral changes. So we always need to be on the lookout. If we see changes in behavior, we need to be thinking what else in this pet's health could be contributing to these behavior changes. And then finally, other two more big sort of body systems are the skin. Now, interestingly, the skin and the brain come from the same embryologic system. So they're both derived from the ectoderm, which is the embryo when the embryo starts to form and in its very sort of early developmental stages. Both the brain and the skin, the central nervous system and the skin, both come from the ectoderm. So it makes perfect sense that the skin and the brain are going to share some similarities when it comes to, the way that their sort of neurochemistry works. And so if you have skin disease, that absolutely can affect behavior. And we've got some really nice papers on both stress, but also fear, anxiety, and aggression with skin diseases and how, that all plays together. And then finally, what about the gastrointestinal tract? Now, we know we have this amazing connection, this bidirectional connection between the gut and the brain. We talk about it as the gut-brain axis, and how the brain can influence gastrointestinal health and how gastrointestinal health influences the brain. And we know that can happen through the vagus nerve, but there are potentially also other mechanisms on how that happens. With some neurotransmitters that are produced in the gut, accessing the brain. There potentially are even some transporters in the blood-brain barrier that allow some of those neurotransmitters to cross. But for sure, there's a connection through the vagus nerve. So all of these things are massively important. And we know how important the microbiome is for overall health and how important the microbiome is also for brain health. So if you have dysbiosis, so if you have a dysregulated microbiome that's not functioning as it should be, of course that's going to affect behavior and the brain and brain health. And so optimizing diet, looking at diet, these are all things that when we think about behavior, we need to be looking at the other body systems. So it's a massively interwoven web, and I just find it so fascinating. And that's why I actually went into, specializing as a veterinary behaviorist, because I think it's really important that we look at behavior not just from the environmental influences and the learning, but from a real whole body kind of point of view. And if we're not doing that, we're doing our patients a disservice, 100%. And more vets need to be coming into this field. More vets need to be aware of all of these kind of connections and influences that the one has on the other. And we really need to be looking at our patients from a whole body system point of view. It's so important for their health, their welfare, and how they exist with us in this world. So, looking at that really holistically is really important. And if we have a look at the humane hierarchy, so I'm going to put this in the show notes as well. If we look at the humane hierarchy of behavior modification, so this is a system that was developed by Dr. Susan Friedman, who really comes from more of the applied behavior analysis side of things. But if you look at her hierarchy, humane hierarchy of behavior modification, the very first foundational point on her hierarchy is wellness, physical wellness, and how nutrition and the wellness of the whole being is the very first thing that we need to address before we move on to things like antecedent arrangements, and then the different elements of behavior modification. So it has to be our foundation. And before we address this, we can't move on. It's almost, you can't pass go if you haven't kind of addressed this. So that physical health and wellness piece is really, really important. All right, that's my little kind of foray into brain health and behavior. And this episode is really just setting the foundations and really thinking about, what are the different things that we need to think about in the brain, whether that's epigenetics, whether that's neurotransmission, whether that's kind of the connections within the brain, and whether that's physical health and how that affects the brain. All of those things are massively important, and we need to be thinking about all of them. So a little foundational episode, which we can refer back to as we delve deeper into each of these individual pieces, and then obviously also how we can influence them and how we as practitioners can actually, advise certain things and think of all of this as part of our treatment plans that we then, design together with the pet parents for that individual pet. Alrighty, guys, that is episode 39, and I'm going to see you next week for episode 40. And I look forward to delving deeper into each of these individual topics in the future. I'm going to link some of the papers I talked about in the show notes, and leave me a comment or questions or discussion points. I'd be really happy to hear your thoughts on this. So see you next week, guys. Bye for now.